Hello, I am Russell Nohelty, USA Today bestselling author of The Godsverse Chronicles, Ichabod Jones Monster Hunter, the editor of the Cthulhu is Hard to Spell anthology, and just all-around writer-type guy.
When sitting down to visualize your world, what are the first things you tend to see most clearly?
So the first thing I see when I develop a world is the characters. I always want to populate the world with characters first. Usually what happens is I will think of a character, and then that character will have to go on a quest, and because I know that character, I know kind of what quest they have to go on. So the thing that would lead them to the biggest growth in their lives. So for my book, Katrina Hates the Dead, which became the Godsverse Chronicles first book, and Death Followed Behind Her. The story is basically, for the graphic novel and the first story in that collection, it was about a girl who was fed up with demons and living in the apocalypse. She sets out to hell to kill the devil. And knowing what her personality was, I knew that the thing that she liked the least was sort of, doing stuff. But she just wanted peace and quiet, and she didn't want to be a hero. So making her the hero, making her do this like big quest, and then filling the world around her and inside of her, and both the starting world, which is what I call it, sort of the first world, where they start, and then where they end, and everything along the way kind of came from what obstacles we need to put into this journey. I don't do it so much now as I did then, because I realized that worlds need to be a lot bigger in scope, especially as the gods first kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and I was sort of filling it in as I went instead of having a cohesive idea from the start. But I do still start with that same idea, and then I just build out more. Instead of building out as I'm writing, I build out before I'm writing now.
How do you like to introduce the elements of your world? In a narration, explaining everything right up front, through unspoken action sprinkled throughout, through dialogue with your characters speaking to one another, or monologues where your characters break the fourth wall and address your audience directly or talk to themselves, or a combo of these things, or something else entirely?
I introduce stories into my world, or pieces of my world, as we go through the action. I absolutely hate expository dialogue where everything is so front-loaded. I think that you should learn what you need to know about the world at the same time as, or slightly before, the character. So, for instance, when there's something coming up that I know they will need to have or to know about, I try to put that information either in the same chapter or at the most 2 chapters back from where the character is now. And how I usually think about that is the character has to perform the action before they need the action. So, for instance, if there's a spell that they need to know, or we need to just know that there is magic in this world, they need to perform that magic in a more inconsequential setting than they do for the actual story to take place. So let's say they have to do a big fire spell to beat a dragon. Well, I don't want them doing that big fire spell at first. I want them to be learning spells along the way. And maybe sort of like in Onward, how there was a progression of magic, and that was the big spell that they had to learn at the end. Well, I want to make sure that we've built up to it. But I'm not going to tell people in the first chapter everything about the world. I'll tell them little bits and pieces, but the most expository dialogue I do is probably, maybe 1 page at a time, probably more like a half page at a time. I prefer to just do it in back and forth, but you also don't want to have your back and forth be just expository dialogue, so you have to sort of mold what is expository dialogue, what is really important to this world, and then what can I get away with people exploring in their mind? Maybe I know what it is, but the public doesn't need to know what it is. So that's how I think about it. There are some things, because I write fantasy, that you just can't do outside of an info dump. I have this big series that I've been working on for a long time, and I've written 4 books, and I'm sort of getting ready to put it out next year. But it's a very complicated how this one realm works, and the only way that I could think to do it was in sort of a 1 to 2 page info dump. But I didn't do that at the beginning of the story. I did it when the character needed to know it.
When it comes to world building, what element do you feel is the most superfluous more times than not?
I think most world building is superfluous, honestly, to the story itself, to writing the story. I think that you can do all of the work that you want to before a story happens, but once you actually get in there, things are going to change, and you have to sort of balance how much world building you want to do beforehand with how much you want to do. Or how elastic your world is. So I like to think of my worlds and as having a lot of elasticity to them, which both means that they can grow into more and more stories, so 8, 12, 16, 100 books, whatever. And then also the elasticity to move and change. And so I like to think of, maybe 4 book bundles. For me, it sort of comes down to about 4 books that take place in one location. And then we've thoroughly explored that location, and then the characters move on. It seems to sort of be what I do, somewhere between 1 and 4 books. I used to have a tendency to just write, but I would write myself into so many corners, and it would be so hard to not break the world, that now what I want to do is say, okay, this is the world of Urgu. It has 6 kingdoms, 6 gods control these kingdoms. And this is sort of where the world is, and this is what I need to know now. But I want to make sure that I have a scope of where the entire world is, or what is going on in the whole world, so that I can move in that world and not break everything. And instead of saying moving somewhere and then saying, well, that's a part of the canon now, I can say, can I move there? And that is helpful to me. But I think doing sort of the deep history of like the last 500 years and all of that stuff is superfluous to me, because so much of it is going to change, and so much of writing a good story is having it be malleable to change. And if you spend 6 months writing a Similarian type book, you are going to find that for me it hinders me, as opposed to help me make the world more real. I find that you're going to use 5 to 10% of the world building that you do. It's good to have, so you can keep it in your quiver and know what's going on. But the audience doesn't need to know more than 5 to 10% of what's going on. And if they want to know more, great. You can then make your World of Ice and Fire, or your Wizarding World of Harry Potter, all of those things to explore it. But it's probably going to be something that you don't use, and I always like to have an economy of that information, and only work on the stuff that is going to be used or has the highest probability of being used.
Where do you find most artists go wrong when it comes to world building?
This goes back to what we were talking about in the last question, but I think that people spend too much time world building, and then the biggest mistake, or the biggest cardinal sin of world building, is when you cram so much world building in just because you did so much work. So I can tell this in books, especially younger people's books. I don't mean young necessarily as age young, but just someone who hasn't written many books, is they feel the need to cram in every piece of research that they've ever done. I was reading this book recently that they discussed all of Oxford. Like every time they went into a room, they would discuss the history of that room, and it ended up being longer than the scene itself. And like, it was fine and interesting, but I could tell that they did the research and they wanted me to know what the research was, and it took away from the story for me. So you want to use your research and use your world building and use all of that to further the story, but you do not want it to hamper the flow of the story.
In thinking about your world expanding, is your approach to add in things you've already created outside of the story you were telling, or creating something from scratch, brand new, to add into and build upon the world that already exists?
I've done both of these things pretty effectively. I will tell you that I have moved to a world where I am constructing everything before I inhabit that world. as a writer. I think that it helps me not break things. But I can show you, actually. So this is the series that I was talking about a little bit earlier. And I'll show you. Like, this is one section. This is all I have of that section. But it's how sort of the fairy realm works and where the courts are, what sort of the different pieces of... but like, this is what I have. Like, it's an overarching thing of the world. Like, certain fairies live in the abyss. Certain them live in the spring court, summer court, autumn court. And I actually think I moved these two courts, the autumn and spring. So I think the spring is now where the autumn is, and the autumn is where the spring is when I actually wrote this story. But that is sort of the world building that I have. This is another one. So this is the underworld, and this is sort of generally where things are. There's a lake, there are cities, there's a hot side, there's a cold side, there's a storm in the middle, and they're all going to come into play. And then I also have characters who I know are going to work. There are fairy queens and kings, but there's an overarching piece that I know. I know how magic works in the world, and I know how the dreams work. The first part was in the dream realm and the nightmare realm. I know how those things work. And so generally what I'm doing is I'm adding things in, but I'm giving enough room to say, well, I don't have this part, and I haven't explained it yet. So I need to add something here that's going to be interesting, or a character here that's going to be interesting, or this part doesn't make sense. I'm going to change it all around. So I do find myself generally adding things in as I go that I have come up with on broad strokes, but then having a world be elastic enough that I can add things that I come up with on the fly. I grew up as a pantser, and then I became a plotter a little bit later in my writing journey, but I still like to have that freedom to make things that are new and interesting and take stories into new and interesting directions. And when I do that, I find that in the way that I'm talking about, I find that it's a nice combination of, I am not going to break the world because I know how the world works, and there is plenty here for me to grow into and add more characters and add things as they come up. And that's I fall kind of in the middle of that spectrum. But I definitely want to add a little bit at a time. So I'll give you an example from the Gods verse. The Gods verse is basically a lot of different mythologies. But in the first book, we dealt with Judeo-Christian. Then the second book, we brought in Norse, then Egyptian, and then moved the time period of present to the future, to the past, back to the present. And by doing that, slowly but surely, we got people to understand each part of the mythology. So when you're talking about, like, whether it's mythology or just pieces of your world, I always like to add one at a time. So one place, explore that one place, and then move on to the next place. Explore this one mythology, let people get comfortable, and don't throw everything to them at once. It's another thing when I find in new writers is they try and throw everything at the beginning of a story, and it scares people off because there's just so much and they don't remember. Whereas what people remember really well is if you're like, we are going to Oz. Here is what Oz is about. Then you get to Oz and you're like, hey, look, here is Oz. Here's what Oz is about. But you've spent a whole book talking kind of about what Oz is and what the world is and all of these things. It grounds people in this story. And the more fantastical your story is, the more of that grounding you have to do. I like to say, and I read this somewhere, but in any book or any story, 80 to 90% of it should be things that people already know, with 10 to 20% being new things that you can explore and weave in there. So I hope that was helpful. My name is Russell Nohelty. You can go to russellnohelty.com, check out my Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and get some free books for signing up for our mailing list. Thanks so much.